Hello everyone, my name is Candace Harmon and this is my presentation for the Psychology and Faith Integration Final. So my topic is on marriage and family therapy. I chose this topic because after I complete my bachelor's degree, I hope to go on to a Pscyh program in marriage and family therapy. So the reason why I got into marriage and family therapy or interested is because when I grew up, I did not grow up in a married household. My parents were not married, and I didn't see a lot of people around me, other kids or students around me who had that situation. It was actually very rare when I met someone whose parents were married. And so that kind of got me to thinking, and throughout my life, I've seen that the repercussions of children of divorce or children who come from single parent households or children or people who came from broken families. And so my interest came from that, from those experiences in helping those people in those situations. And so before I came to Christ, I had a lot of questions of what it was supposed to look like, what love was supposed to look like, what relationships were supposed to look like, what family was supposed to look like. And I feel like a lot of those things are grounded in the way we were raised and the way that we were brought up. A lot of those questions aren't answered for people who don't have that kind of household or that kind of environment being brought up. So that struck up my interest in marriage and family therapy. Along this time with my relationship with Christ, in reading the Bible and learning and gaining understanding of biblical principles, I realized that a lot of the questions that I were asking was actually answered in the Bible. So then that helped me say, oh wow, I really want to be able to give people this information, but I don't want to do it in a church setting. I really want to go out to the people who are broken and who don't know Christ. And so there went my love for psychology, which also gave me those answers. The problem that I had was that I didn't understand how to go about integrating Christianity and psychology. While I didn't see the two as mutually exclusive, I didn't understand how to integrate the two, especially in a secular setting, being as though I don't want to do Christian counseling. I specifically just want to be a marriage and family counselor. And so there are a few things that I've learned from this class that has helped me in that integration process and helping me to facilitate what that might look like. The first thing that I'd like to mention is the expert training. So as I mentioned, it's hard for me, being a Christian, to kind of set that to the side. So I wasn't sure how to, like I said, integrate my faith into my practice in marriage and family therapy. So with expert training, it gives me the tools to be able to learn how to communicate with someone and ask them what their views are, if they've ever considered their faith as a means of treatment. And so that helped me and gave me an open door of starting the conversation. There's a few other things that have also helped me throughout this course. And the first being the five views of integrating Christianity and psychology. There are two views that I specifically want to highlight that I felt were the most helpful to me and the most like what I already kind of felt like. The first being the levels of explanation. So what that is, David G. Myers wrote the levels of explanation in our text. And the levels of explanation are just saying that, he uses this quote, that reality is a multi-layered unity. So he also uses an example of love. And so in love, he says, love can be explained from a theological standpoint. It can be explained from a psychological standpoint. It can be explained from a biological standpoint, chemistry standpoint. There's different levels to explain the same thing. And so I like that because he relates psychology to Christianity, and that psychology is just another layer of explaining what the Bible has already given to us as truth. And I loved that. And he also explained how God has already given us a kind of a challenge. He said, to test these things, to go and explore his creation, because that brings him glory. And so the quote that he used was in Thessalonians. And that helps me to kind of gain a better understanding of how psychology and Christianity can be explaining the same thing. I never actually understood before that I already kind of do those things, that I already kind of, when I get into conversations with people, for example, about certain things in science. Well, they'll say, well, what does the Bible, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about, let me see, for example, creation. Sometimes people will say, well, science says this, but the Bible only says this. And I will say, well, you know what? That's not saying that science is wrong. It could just be a new level of explanation for that. And I feel like that's very helpful in my, like I said, in my future practice with that. The next level of explanation, keeping with the levels of explanation. Myers also mentions that we have to be aware of our self-serving biases. This is something that we understand and know already, but it is nice to be reminded of how our biases can shape the way that we view things, and we can also project things onto others, or change the meanings of things to help them serve our own biases. And so I thought that was very helpful of him to remind and give kind of thought to of how I can, not use my Christianity as a lens of, projecting things onto other people. That actually gave me food for thought for that. Also, I like that Myers explains that in the levels of explanation, he gives an example of how there were empirical studies trying to test the validity of prayer. And what they did was they had they had two groups. Both groups were sick, but they had one group pray for them and another group not prayed for. And then they tested to see which one was healed faster or which one was healed. And so something that Myers mentions is that there's certain things that can't be tested and that it just has to be by faith. And then he goes on to explain why those studies wouldn't work in that way. And I think that's very helpful because being Christian, and you have to understand that there is something called faith that can't be empirically tested in that way. So that was another thing to actually bring up for food for thought. And the next level of explanation was the transformational level. The next view was transformational. I really enjoyed transformational. This is why. Because in the transformational view, it starts first with the person. So, with the therapist in this case, with me. It starts first in having a transformation in myself, with my beliefs, with my walk with Christ, and then going on to help others. And so I feel as though that's kind of where I'm already coming from. I've already had this transformation. I've already, been guided by the Spirit and walking in the Spirit. And now I'm able to be prepared to help others. And coming from this standpoint, what I liked the most about it was that it starts out with the Bible. It starts off with your faith. It starts off with Christianity. Whereas there was a few other views that kind of mixed and matched the two. This one is like saying, no, this is my foundation. And that's biblical, right? So your foundation is in Christ. So anything that I should do with the foundation of Christ. And then reaching out, like I said, with the levels of explanation, I'm able to say, hey, listen, these two are not mutually exclusive. That brings me to my next point. The next thing that was very helpful for me throughout this course in understanding preparing me for the future is that there are people who view psychology and Christianity as completely separate. They feel as though they need to remain separate, or they feel as though they're clashing or they're nemesis. These things are helpful to know because first I never encountered that before. And also, it's helpful because it helps me to prepare myself and to prepare my statements, my beliefs, to help and kind of combat that, what those negative viewpoints of Christian psychologists. And what was most interesting to me was from the Christian side of that argument. So the Christian side of that argument was that psychologists are basically acting as God, or they're trying to replace God with their psychological viewpoints. And so they said, God is enough, and that is it. And then from the other side, they were saying, listen, we're able to heal people. People are being healed. This method works. So maybe your methods don't work, or maybe whatever you're doing is completely separate from whatever we're doing. I've seen the in-between. There was a quote in the Bible. I'm sorry, not in the Bible. There was a quote that in the book that was explaining the 5 Views books, that was explaining, and it was a physician, and the physician said, I only bandaged them, and God healed them. And when I saw that quote, I thought it was very similar to how I feel myself. So in seeing the Christian side of things, where they're like, well, God is able to heal and that's it. And then the other side that says, we have the tools. I felt like that quote was exactly the middle ground that I feel like. I feel as though with psychology, I have tools in order to give to someone, but the healing actually ultimately comes from God. So I'm not going to heal those people. I'm just going to give them tools for healing and point them in the direction of the healer. And like I said, all of these components have kind of come together to allow me to do that. Again, with expert training, I'm able to actually say the name Jesus. So if, of course, they allow that. If not, then I have to go by, again, the spirit from transformational psychology in order to guide people in that way. And the next thing is, I wanted to mention that. So I also used some resources from a journal article, from a few different journals on marriage and family therapy. So I have this book, Sacred Marriage. I used the Blue Parakeet. I also used the 5 Views. I also used the journal articles, like I stated, and I also used one other book, which was Things I Wish I Knew Before I Were Married. That book is also by Gary Thomas. So I used all of these things, and I kind of put together what it would look like for me personally in the personal section, the personal application section, what it would look like for me to personally put these things into practice. And for me, I thought, okay, well, those 2 views were the most related to my own personal philosophy and my own personal mission. And so my mission is to help marriages in particular. The reason why I'm focusing on marriages, even though it's marriage and family therapy, is because I feel like marriage is kind of the foundation, and the output of a good and healthy marriage will be, if they choose to have children, will be healthy children as well if we give them the proper tools. Again, all of these things are rooted back into biblical principles. So one thing that Scott McKnight from the Blue Parakeet said, there was a lot of controversy with this book, but the one thing that I feel as though he stated that we need to read the Bible in our day, in our way. I'm going to take that, I'm going to change that a little bit. I feel as though we need to use biblical principles for our day, in our way. Not in our way, but in our day, we need to use the biblical principles that have been pushed aside just by society and just by things that are changing a little bit. And so with that, I came up with a slogan of sorts, which is my mission is to keep marriages on par. And PAR is actually an acronym that I created for, I'm just going to look over here because I have it written down, for prevention, awareness, reconciliation, and response. So in this, this has helped me. So all of the resources that I gathered together. So the resources that I gathered about the articles were regarding, I had to take a look and see what have they already done as far as integrating Christianity and psychology into the field of marriage and family therapy. So I looked at a few articles and I was trying to see what are some of the challenges, what are some of the successes in integrating Christianity in psychology in a secular setting. And so with that research, along with the books that I've mentioned that I read, I came up with this acronym. And so the acronym is actually a 3-step process that I feel as though would be how I would integrate Christianity into psychology, into specifically aiding couples in marriage therapy. So the first is prevention. And so for prevention, the goal of prevention here is for both the married couples and premarital couples. Prevention for the premarital couple looks like preventing that couple once they become married, preventing that couple from facing some of the issues that married couples often face. And some of those things were outlined in the book, Things That I Wish I Knew Before I Were Married. So what I did was I took some of those techniques from Things That I Wish That I Knew Before I Was Married. Just a little background on that book. That book was written and it has a Christian basis. So he was explaining some of the things that people run into in both Christian and non-Christian couples run into at the beginning of their marriages, some obstacles. So in reading that book, I kind of highlighted some of the things that he spoke of, and then I went with some biblical principles. So I added a story from the Bible and expressed those things there, as well as some things from the articles that I had looked up, some techniques that were being used that were successful. So I kind of built and gathered those things together to kind of build what it would look like for me, like I said, to integrate the two. So for the prevention stage, for the premarital couple, I was trying to prevent the premarital couple into seeing some of the challenges that married couples face who haven't had that. So then for the married couple, the prevention stage looks like preventing them from running into some other obstacles that other married couples have reported as well. Preventing them, even the differences that they're already in the marriage setting. So then awareness is the next step that I seen in my research. Again, these things are things that I've made up the name for it and put it in these areas, but this is all coming from my research. So the awareness stage is bringing awareness to both the premarital and married couple. Awareness of how communication skills and awareness of how they communicate, awareness how the other person communicates, awareness of their biggest issues, fears, whatever, what have you. Again, those things and those points that I'm talking about are taken from the articles as well as the books that I've mentioned. So I kind of put those things together and used biblical principles to help facilitate that area. So the next is reconciliation. So the next step is reconciliation, and in this step I feel like as a therapist I would help the couple with areas that they've already had disputes about, areas that they've already had maybe some pain or some hurts. This is a reconciliation stage to provide healing to them in those areas. Again, this all comes from biblical principles. It comes from prior research from that is already being done, as well as some books in marriage and family therapy. So the next stage is response. So the response stage is basically asking the clients, so to speak, how they're going to respond to everything that they've learned. for the premarital couple, what is the response? The response is, what is your next step? Are you going to become married? Are you going to end the relationship? Are you going to extend the engagement? Whatever the response is, whatever your next step is, that's what this stage is about. For the married couple, it's the same. What is the next step for you? Obviously, my ultimate goal is not for divorce. So the response stage would be, how can I further help you in any of these areas? So I thought that was really cool. I thought that was really helpful. In my paper, I kind of go in depth on each step. This is just a brief overview of what I do in each step and what I've kind of pulled from in each step to kind of help me to understand how can I help someone in marriage and family therapy, and how can I do that in a Christian way in today. So that's the basis of my paper. Thank you guys so much for watching.